just make sure I'm recording. Yes, okay, great. All right, so I thought I'd start with a general question. And probably it came up in one of our sessions, but I just thought maybe we should just talk a little bit about it, which is the form of the text, right? So it's a dialogue, and all Plato has written is dialogues, right? And they are plays, and they are dramatic twists and turns, and at the same time, it's philosophy. It's considered philosophy. So my question to you was, how do you approach the text? Do you approach it purely as a philosophical text, and if so, why? Or do you approach it as a dialogue, as it is a dialogue, and it's a drama with a point and questions and a story? And if you read it that way, why? So I'd like to have some impressions.
Wow.
Because it's going to change, it's going to change your approach or the way you approach the text. So that's why it's really important for us to understand the form of the text and what we intend to get out of it. And if you really consider it as a philosophical treatise, the expectations are different. If you treat it as a form of play and a dialogue with a philosophical point, you'll treat it differently. You'll approach it differently. So I'm just curious how you read it. Scott.
Yeah, I've been reading it like a philosophical dialogue, and actually Laura and I even had a little chat about this, and some of it is because we've read the Meno with such a close read, and we're really reading this first chapter with such a close read. It seems that we're dissecting the arguments and trying to understand the arguments at a really deep level. But in some sense, I think that it'd be a mistake in that, if you were to step back and think of this as literature, you might be more forgiving to some of the statements that the characters are making, and then see it more as characters. And that the person actually, oh gosh, who was our friend from a few classes ago that left us, Mary? Ben. We were reading the Credo, and Ben, I actually diagrammed an argument of what the Credo all meant, and then Ben sitting there and he says, I think Credo really loved Socrates. And I'm like, what? He only read it like literature, and that kind of clued me into it, but yeah.
Yes. Mary Jo. Oh, sorry, Mary.
Well, in part because of some of the discussion that you've brought up, and I think the essay that I probably shouldn't have read, but I did read at the end, I've been reading it more as history. So because the way we framed it in the first class is this was Athens in a particular time in history, and Plato had a role and his brothers are participating, and this is Plato's response in part to the trial of Socrates. And I think that's been sort of helpful. What hasn't been helpful, and maybe it's because I'm a lawyer, is I tend to read the dialogue like a deposition question, which just riles me up because I just think, oh, that's a false dichotomy. No. And then I get bogged down in that. So this is my own personal problem with reading the dialogue.
Mary Jo. And then Jane.
Yeah, I remember being frustrated with Plato last year. And when we got to Aristotle, I was like, okay, good. He's just telling us what he means, and this is more comfortable for me. So I'm always trying to turn it into a treatise where you just give us the answers. Mm-hmm. So, maybe I would be happier if I looked at it as a play, but I find it a lot more work to do that.
Jay.
Hi, me?
Yes, I thought you would.
So, yes, I'm glad you asked this question. I think it's a great question. I'm not saying that to butter you up. I am struggling with this. I
Yes.
share Mary's pain, for sure. I think I'm more oriented towards stories, and this just doesn't hold together as a story. I think it would flop on Broadway. But any event, and I'm not sure I have a philosophical gene. I mean, it just is so opaque to me that I read it over and I agree with Mary, like, okay, you're going from step A to B, but C doesn't follow from B in my mind sometimes. Like he leaps to the soul from ears and eyes. I mean, to me, that is a huge leap.
Yes, very good. Kit.
That's it.
I was just going to say this sort of the struggle among ideas. It puts at least me and I think us as readers in a position of one of the group gathered around listening to this, and so we do have to sort of figure, as opposed to a philosophical treatise where the author clearly lays out what they think and want us to then understand. We witness this interplay of ideas and have to kind of chart for ourselves what is really happening.
Gary.
I think one of the reasons why I'm struggling through this is, for me, what's the lack of a context. I realize we're working on something that's more timeless than timely, but I'm not picking up any larger traditions like in the Shakespeare plays or any of the plays that we've read so far, okay? Or a grander tradition like in the Iliad or the Odyssey, okay? I mean, it's almost like, I do appreciate the Socratic method, but the scope of it, I find is very overwhelming. I mean, it is just almost one long, question just gives way to another and to another and to another. And for me, there's no end in sight. There's no goal line that you've crossed. You can't spike the philosophical ball or anything like that. Like you've arrived at some place. For me, the only places I've arrived is basically back at the beginning, and I never knew where I was starting from in the first place. So,
that's fair.
There's just a lack of context for me. Okay, and I could certainly appreciate why something like this is, clearly the nature of the work. I mean, if any book was slated for a tutorial, it would be The Republic. I mean, this is something that, you just don't pick up casually. I mean, you have to take that classic deep dive into for a prolonged period of time. I don't, being a retired high school teacher, I'm looking for quizzes or exams or a paper to write on something like this, okay? And
do you want to do that? I can give you questions.
No, I mean,
yeah.
Counting my blessings, that none of those devices, I don't think there would be solutions any more than the way I'm going now. So, that's really I guess the look back to where I started from, the lack of context for me.
Yes. Okay. That's excellent. That's very good. So, because I asked myself the same question, that's why I asked you, like, how do you approach the text? Because I asked myself, how do I approach this text? How do I approach actually Plato?
Well, how do you approach it?
And so what I understood it to be is that these are all dialogues. And one thing that Plato is doing, and I think I said that earlier, is that he's really trying to give words to his master's teachings, right? To Socrates' ideas and his thought. Socrates kind of, he just was a sage. He was just kind of roaming about the streets and, he didn't really write anything down. And so Plato is the one who is going to pen the thoughts of his teacher. Now, of course, there is a vast amount of scholarship on whether this is Socrates or is this Plato? I don't think we should get into that because we'll never get out of that swamp. It's like, okay, so I tried to simplify it for myself by saying, well, Plato is really trying to give coherence to Socratic philosophy. Really, what Plato is doing is teaching us how philosophy became Socratic in this moment with Plato. When Plato started putting these dialogues in a form, and so I think these texts, it might be helpful to approach these texts as a form of dialogues, right? Dialogues with a point, with a question. And mind you, there is just one question that Plato asked. And it has many manifestations. But the question really was, what is virtue? How can one live a good life? And in order to answer this question, he goes in several directions, right? He goes into understanding what is beauty, what is justice, what is virtue, what is truth. And with that, he's trying to give coherence to his own understanding or theory of the forms. That was the big Platonic project, right? So it is a very early expression of philosophy, if we want to say that. With Aristotle, and I say that just to irk all the Plato scholars, but with Aristotle, philosophy becomes a little bit more complex, because he is writing philosophical treatises. He is not choosing not to write dialogues. So it's a very deliberate choice, and the choice has consequences that Plato made, right? So I would say it might help us if we do read it as an interpersonal dialogue, because that's what Socrates is doing. That's how Plato is portraying Socrates to his audiences, to his readers. What he is cognizant of is that the dialogue is empathic. It's interpersonal, right? Although you might say, is Socrates being really empathic? He can be insulting, sometimes in very subtle ways, and that's something we have been kind of seeing. And so I would say, if we kind of read it through this lens, we might have a different understanding and a different set of questions, right? Now, the Socratic method, Mary, the Socratic method is unpleasant, I suppose, can be unpleasant, because it doesn't give us the gratification of knowing the answers. Because, in all the dialogues that you read, Meno, Crito, especially in Meno, I think the premise was really that you arrive at a definition only by question. So Socrates is saying, well, I'm not going to give you an answer about what is virtue or whether it can be taught, but I will keep asking you questions so that you arrive at a definition of virtue. Yes? So it's a very peculiar exercise of arriving at an understanding. And something that I wonder about, and I would like to write about, is that, is Socratic method even possible in our time? I know that lawyers do it. And is it only applicable to the profession of law? I don't know. I say that because, to speak to Jay's point, because we do need context. These texts are not produced in ether. These texts are produced in very specific time and context. They are responding to changes that have occurred. right? It's not some, these texts are not produced in some kind of void, and in that sense, if we think that that is the case, then they won't make really any sense to us. It would be a pointless exercise. So we read them, and that's why I think the Republic, so the context, the little bit of context that I could provide, or I wanted to provide, through the help of the footnotes that we covered in our very first class, is that it is presenting to its readers a different world. Something new is needed, is required. And that something new is expected of Socrates. He's expected to offer his new teachings on religion, his new teachings on philosophy, his new teachings on what is just, because nobody knows what that is anymore. Right? So it's a great moment of uncertainty, right? And so the Republic is written in that context. And if you know that, I think we can then parse things out, right? The compulsion to ask what is just, right? How can you live a good life, a flourishing life, when there's so much uncertainty? Mary Jo.
Just a little on your question of whether it's applicable to today. I think that's very interesting. And I immediately thought of that, how it's applicable to me in my daily life, which is testing the logic of my young adult children when they come up with certain conclusions, and just to say, you're not thinking logically, and to keep asking questions. What do you really think? What do you really mean? And we certainly need that in our society today, because people jump to conclusions. So I'm curious how you mean whether it's applicable to today. If you're talking about, of course, we all think about politics, but in our daily lives, what you were thinking.
Well, I was thinking about what are the questions that are significant to our lives? What are the questions that we ask, that are applicable to us? Are we asking ourselves, and is our society asking itself how to live a just life? Are we asking ourselves how to live a well-lived life, right? Are we puzzling over the notion of what is virtue? Or our concerns are slightly different. Are we experiencing, or do we practice the same kind of democratic life that Athenians practiced? Was Athens a mass society? I mean, who were the people who sat on the city council, and talked about these questions? Right? It was not mass democracy, right? Women were not allowed to vote. Propertyless people were not allowed to vote, right? Our democracy is so different. And so our questions are also different.
But you still have the question of whether you're just making assumptions and following tradition, or really thinking through, is this the right way to live? And it's difficult. People would much rather say, oh, well, this is just how it's always been done, or this is what's right because this book says that's what's right, or yes. It's really important, but it's really hard, I think.
Yes, it's hard. I mean, I think we do think about how to live a purposeful life. I think that is probably our question. But we might have different tools. I don't know. So it is probably a good exercise for us to think about what are the similarities and the differences, in their concept of the just, in our concept of the just, in their concept of virtue and our concept of virtue, in their concept of love and our concept of love. So, there might be some overlaps, but there might not be any overlaps. I'm just kind of throwing out there for you to puzzle on this as we read, and we can talk about this. Okay. So thanks. Yes, Jay.
One thing that I keep thinking of when I read, what is it, Thrasymachus? Am I saying that right?
Thrasymachus, yes.
That I think of, the kind of puckish definition of a golden rule. Who has the gold rules? That's kind of what he was saying.
Oh, so actually, Jay, I wanted to say one more thing to your question about like the context and the traditions that have been invoked in the text. So it's all there, actually. So, and that's why you're taking the class, and we're going to kind of parse it out together. So the tradition, of course, is those of the Sophists, and Thrasymachus belongs to that tradition. And it's very distinctive than the Athenian tradition, right? It's been brought out almost in every dialogue that Plato has written, right? In the Meno, in the Republic, it's all there. And there is a kind of a rivalry between the two traditions, right? So that's one clue. That's how you can contextualize the text. The other clue is, of course, the invocation of Homer. The first on the first day of class, when we read Cephalus, and he asks him about his old age, right? Socrates wants to learn from Cephalus, right? How does it feel to be old? How was this road, right? And he invokes Homer, right? So there are all of these clues in which the Greek tradition and the tradition of the Greek Enlightenment has been invoked, right? And so the other thing that we should probably think about is that Socrates is portraying himself as a representative of that Greek Enlightenment that is associated with Homer, and that tradition is in some kind of crisis. Right? The Republic actually presents a turn to that, right? And we have to see, what we are also trying to see is that how Socrates is answering to that moment of crisis, and also how Plato is writing about it, right? And we need to think, okay, what are the shifts that have occurred in that post-Homeric world, the post-Greek Enlightenment world, right? It's actually being questioned. And there's a lot of uncertainty around that. Yes? Yes. Rita?
So is Plato providing like an allegory to, I wrote it down, let's see, on how to best govern one's soul? Is he like providing a blueprint for governance or good conscience, or would you say that?
Sure, yes. There is a framework in which Plato wants to figure out and tell his readers how to live a good life. What does it take to live a just life? Jonathan?
Yeah, just to pick up on what Jay said a while ago about how this doesn't work for me as a drama, is because Socrates never meets his match. And in other fields, you have Einstein and Bohr arguing quantum physics and relativity until the days they die. And they're equally valid and equally insightful. In politics, you have Lincoln and Douglas debating and they finish these debates, and it's mixed on who won or who didn't win, or who lost. Socrates always wins. He is always surrounded dramatically by people who say, that's right. You have a point. That's right. I mean, it's an easy role to play. So as drama, it doesn't work. I get we're trying to learn the Socratic method, but you know what? Ask questions. That's the Socratic method. Got it. I wish it were more of a philosophical treatise, and maybe like Aristotle, because what Aristotle is doing is he's engaging us as readers and presuming we're equals and saying, let's have this debate through the literature that I'm writing. Plato is like, it's a foregone conclusion. He's having the debate kind of resolved for us on stage, and it's just crappy drama.
I empathize with what you just said. I felt the same way. That's right. It's not on an even plane. You know, Socrates wins. He has an upper hand. And so it's something we cannot change about this, you know, so we have to take it as it is. And, you know, that's why we need probably, it might help. And I try to do it. So approach the text with an open mind and really just see where it takes us. You know, that might make it more enjoyable, you know. But the things that you have said, that they're all right. It's an exchange between two unequal partners. And it's a battle that Socrates seems to win. Like it's always on his own terms. You know, he would just take people for a nice ride, only to humiliate them, it seems. And then you're like, well, that's not fair. Oh, I hate the Socratic method, you know? So, but it is what it is. And you know, I don't know, at the end of book 1, I wonder if you thought that Socrates thought that he had failed in talking about justice. It's something to think about. I'm just throwing it out there. Okay, so where were we? I kind of left off on this question about what might be the strengths and weaknesses of Thrasymachus's argument. Right, so we learned about his definition of justice. And do you recall what his definition of justice was? Mary.
Justice is the advantage of the stronger, I think, is the punchline.
Justice is right. Okay, and what did Socrates, how did he respond to Thrasymachus's idea of justice of the strong?
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of arguments in there. My vague recollection, please someone help me out, is he showed that rulers make mistakes.
Yes.
And then if you can make a mistake, yada, 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 on you win. What I thought was, you know, unlike everybody else, I watched the video. I thought there was some actual weight to what Thrasymachus was saying but maybe that's a 21st century perspective. The label we put on the application of power that results in law is justice, right? But that's a label, not an actuality, not the substance of it. So I thought there were two things going on there. Thrasymachus made the very accurate, I thought, real world point that the label that we apply to things as justice is really the exercise of political power. But Socrates was talking about something else in the end.
Scott.
Yeah, I agree with Mary. Actually, when they, and who's the first character?
Cephalus.
Yeah, let's say
Polemarchus.
Cephalus, but Cephalus said basically justice is fair, and then Thrasymachus says justice is obeying the law, and then you go to like Aristotle, and he basically says justice is being fair and obeying the law. So in some sense, they kind of answered it early on, and then Socrates gets them all off the track, and it really isn't even, he's defining justice within his statements. He's using the word just as if you already know what it is, but then he's trying to prove some definite. I mean, it's a very kind of like winding ideological argument that he uses throughout this chapter.
You mean Socrates?
Socrates, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. So, okay, good. So Thrasymachus's definition of justice was that it benefits the strong, right? And actually he went so far as to say that it is tyranny that actually brings happiness, right? And then that gave Socrates an entry point. And he said, well, what if rulers make mistakes? Then what? Then would you uphold the fact that justice is about the strong, right? What if the ruler himself has weaknesses and makes mistakes, right? And to that, do you recall what Thrasymachus' answer was? Or how Socrates is going to lead toward his another or second argument? Yes, Lauren.
How I parse that paragraph on page 18, where he talks about, where Thrasymachus talks about making mistakes. And he says, I suppose rather than that it, wait a minute. I suppose rather that this is just our manner of speaking. The doctor made a mistake, the calculator made a mistake, and the grammarian. But I suppose that each of these men, insofar as what he is we address him as, never makes mistakes. I guess I kind of saw that as the crux of the paragraph, and that I'm thinking he's saying, well, you know, no one's perfect. I mean, they may make a mistake, but they're still an expert, and they're still the person we go to for, you know, quote unquote, absolute knowledge on the subject. And so, and then I don't know how to extend that, whether he's saying, you know, justice isn't perfect, that, you know, it's something we strive towards, but, you know, the leader is in charge. And so therefore it's just, you know, you just have to go with it. And that's his way of explaining away mistakes.
Mm-hmm. So Thrasymachus, of course, thought there is a perfect knowledge of rule, right? He is saying that there is no room for mistakes. None of the craftsmen make mistakes, right? And then Socrates is contradicting him or challenging him to say, well, what if they make mistakes? Rulers do make mistakes, right? Yes, no? And then he goes on, Thrasymachus, and actually, I want us to get to what Socrates is going to now answer, his own intervention, right? How is he going to now argue for what he has just said and shown Thrasymachus that, you know, rulers do make mistakes. So he's puncturing his notion, or Thrasymachus' notion, of the justice of the strong, right? Justice only benefits the rulers, right? So in some ways it is connected, going back to Polemarchus, when he said justice is doing good to friends and harming the enemies. And then he was able to convince Polemarchus that no, justice benefits friends and harms no one, right? And so here he is going to employ the same techniques. And he wants to come to the conclusion how justice is good for everyone, right? Because justice really means living a flourishing life, a happy life, a good life, right? And so The distinction to keep in mind, perhaps, is that whereas Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus have a narrow understanding and definition of justice that has to do, as we talked about, Cephalus, that had to do with honesty. Polemarchus's definition had to do with loyalty. And Thrasymachus is the only person who actually was thinking about justice and legalities, right? The craft of rulership. Now, Socrates, we could say, is trying to be more philosophical, right? He wants to arrive at a more capacious understanding, and that's why he is kind of pointing to the holes in their arguments, okay? That this doesn't add up, right? It is still, what I can ask you, like, okay, is there a perfect craftsmanship? Is there a perfect ruler? Because also the truth is that right now in Athens, in this moment, there isn't a perfect ruler, right? Socrates is wondering about how to avert tyranny. Is there a way out? Is it possible to do so? Is it possible to restore the Athenian democracy? So that's the question that he's wondering about. So let's see in section 345B, when Socrates is going to articulate his second argument, and that's very interesting. So let's read through this section. And may I have a volunteer? Lisa, would you like to read? Good.
Yes. Start with and how?
Yes.
And how, he said, shall I persuade you? If you're not persuaded by what I've just said now, what more shall I do for you? Shall I take the argument and give your soul a forced feeding? By Zeus, don't you do it, I said. But first, stick to what you said, or if you change what you set down, make it clear that you're doing so, and don't deceive us. As it is, Thrasymachus, you see that, still considering that what went before, after you had first defined the true doctor, you later thought it no longer necessary to keep a precise guard over the true shepherd. Rather, you think that he, insofar as he is a shepherd, fattens the sheep, not looking to what is best for the sheep, but like a guest who is going to be feasted, to good cheer, or in turn, to the sale, like a moneymaker and not a shepherd. The shepherd's art surely cares for nothing but providing the best for what it has been set over. For that the art's own affairs be in the best possible way is surely adequately provided for so long as it lacks nothing of being the shepherd's art. And similarly, I, for my part, thought just now that it is necessary for us to agree that every kind of rule, insofar as it is rule, considers what is best for nothing other than for what is ruled and cared for, both in political and private rule. Do you think that the rulers in the cities, those who truly rule, rule willingly? By Zeus, I don't think it, he said. I know it well. But, Thrasymachus, I said, what about the other kinds of rule? Don't you notice that no one wishes to rule voluntarily, that they demand wages as though the benefit from ruling were not for them, but for those who are ruled? Now tell me this much. Don't we, at all events, always say that each of the arts is different on the basis of having a different capacity? And don't answer contrary to your opinion, you blessed man, so that we can reach a conclusion. Yes, he said, this is the way they differ. And does each of them provide us with some peculiar benefit and not a common one? As the medical art furnishes us with health, the pilot's art with safety in sailing, and so forth with the others? Certainly. And does the wage earner's art furnish wages? For this is its power. Or do you call the medical art the same as the pilot's art? Or if you wish to make precise distinctions according to the principle you set down, Even if a man who is a pilot becomes healthy because sailing on the sea is advantageous to him, nonetheless, you don't for that reason call what he does the medical art. Surely not, he said. Nor do you, I suppose, call the wage earner's art the medical art, even if a man who is earning wages should be healthy. Surely not, he said. And what about this? Do you call the medical art the wage earner's art, even if a man practicing medicine should earn wages? He said that he did not. And we did agree that the benefit of each art is peculiar. Let it be, he said. Then, whatever benefit all the craftsmen derive in common is plainly derived from their additional use of some one common thing that is the same for all. It seems so, he said. And we say that the benefit the craftsmen derive from receiving wages comes to them from their use of the wage earner's art in addition. He assented with resistance.
Okay, good, good. So no one rules willingly. That's the claim. Why? What is Socrates trying to show here? Also, actually, I wanted to ask you another question. What do you think, or if you could glean in any way, Thrasymachus' motivations in engaging Socrates in this argument? I mean, of course, he insulted him a lot.
Mm-hmm.
He called his questioning ridiculous. He said he never gives answers. He called Socrates that he's full of childish innocence when he brought up the issue of the wet nurse. Like, he was very humiliating toward Socrates, insulted him, and he got really angry. So also, let's keep in mind, and I think that is the dramatic aspect of this writing, right? So Thrasymachus' motivations, he is arguing, and what he is saying is motivated by his own ambitions, right? So what are his ambitions in front of the youth that he is with in this room, and in the context of this political uncertainty, that they are debating the issue of justice, the issue of piety. We should not forget, we talked about the goddess, the goddess that came up on the first page, and we'll end the first book with that reference. So, all that Thrasymachus is saying is actually motivated by his own political ambitions. And with that, he wants to impress his audience. He wants to present himself as a strong next ruler, maybe. He knows the arts of rulership. He can be a tyrant if needed. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And Socrates is aware of that. He can sense it. And maybe Socrates doesn't want him to be the next ruler. So, and then it's like, then Socrates keeps saying he assented without resistance. He gave in, and then you would wonder, why? Is Thrasymachus backing off his ambitions? So what is going on? That's why if we read it as a dialogue, as a play, there is a different kind of richness that we will begin to notice. They won't be these are not just, dry ideas. And there is this tension. There is this political tension. There's a philosophical tension. And I think that's what Plato wanted to convey to his audiences, right? And so I don't want us to lose sight of this aspect of drama. Drama is bringing to the fore that philosophy or philosophical treatise cannot bring to the fore in the same way. You know, it's going to move us in different ways. So it's just important to keep in mind, okay, who is Thrasymachus? Let's just remind ourselves. He has political ambitions, he has motivations. And it is through those that he is articulating his ideas about what justice is. All right? And that's why he shifts. Thrasymachus' ideas are not set in stone. His positions has shifted, and it's going to shift. Right? Okay, so Socrates, and you know, this whole example of the shepherd. What is Socrates trying to do with this example of the shepherd? Who is the shepherd? What is the role? Yeah, Lisa.
I just ask a question just based on what you were saying. So we know that Socrates has convinced Polymarchus to change his thought process. Do we think that Thrasymachus is trying maybe to do the same thing in pushing this type of argument, knowing that Polymarchus is probably going to be the next leader, but knowing that Polymarchus has sort of switched his thought process to that of Socrates, Thrasymachus is continuing to push his own differentiating thought process. So do you think that's because he's trying to change Polymarchus's view back to something else? Or does that just not have any impact and he's just got his thoughts in mind and that's what he's going to push against Socrates?
Good question. Very good question. So that's really good. So there are these three, at least, players who are vying for power. Polymarchus, Thrasymachus, and the other person who's going to come up is Glaucon. Right? So they are the three potential future rulers, probably. And they are all very ambitious. And Socrates understands that. And so Polymarchus, who has been won over by Socrates, doesn't mean that he's not going to come back and reassert himself, you know. But yes, you know, but Thrasymachus here is solely motivated by what he wants, right? And therefore, he's trying to present himself in a different light than Polymarchus. He doesn't care that Polymarchus has gone over to the dark side. Mm. You know, he's like, okay, good riddance. Now I should be the one. People should listen to me, right? All these young men should listen to me, right? And that's why he was insulting. He was angry because that's the point he wants to deliver, that I can do better. So, and Socrates is aware, he understands that. And therefore, it's really interesting. I mean, the shepherd here is Thrasymachus, you know, and so I want us to say a little bit more, and I would like to gather your thoughts, what you thought about it. What kind of a shepherd Thrasymachus is in Socrates' view? Okay, sorry, so Scott.
Yeah, I just maybe stating the obvious, but I thought, you know, a shepherd in some sense is taking care of the flock. So, you know, herds them to water, lets them graze. One gets lost, finds them, brings them back into the herd, chases off wild animals, you know, all those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. The other version is the shepherd is getting the sheep ready to be slaughtered. You know, it wants to fatten them up, and then he's going to sell them, and then they're going to be sent off to be, you know, butchered and eaten. So in a sense, both are true. The question, what is the motivation of the shepherd themselves? You know, and maybe that's the question there.
That's exactly right. And that's what Socrates is pushing him to answer. What kind of a shepherd are you going to be? Are you going to shepherd us kindly with justice? Or are you just going to slaughter us, you know, as a tyrannical ruler? You know, do you really know the ministry of, you know, ruling, the art of ruling? So Yeah, so Socrates is questioning Thrasymachus' ability to be a just ruler. You know, he's asking him what kind of a shepherd he's going to be. Right? And so he's complicating. I mean, that nobody's willing to be a ruler. That's a peculiar idea. Where is Socrates going with it? Why wouldn't they be willing rulers?
I'm sorry, what's the last thing you said?
Why would they not be willing rulers? Socrates is saying no one rules willingly. What does he mean by that?
He means that a ruler, ideally, the art of ruling is to take care of the people you're ruling, not to take care of yourself. That's Socrates' view.
Mm-hmm.
And so since I don't know, maybe this is too strong, but since ideally you're acting in a way that's selfless, you're looking out for others, and therefore you're not directly benefiting yourself, and that's why you need to be paid a wage.
Okay, so what are the wages of ruling according to Socrates? Good segue, yes.
Didn't he say later on there's three? There's income, honor, or avoiding somebody who would do a worse job than you.
Penalty.
Penalty, excuse me. Yes.
Right. And so, okay, that's a very good point. So we still have to figure out what Socrates is trying to say with why rulers might be unwilling to rule. And he kind of says, well, they're unwilling to rule because there are three forms of wages. There is money, honor, and penalty. But penalty is very peculiar, right? What is the penalty of ruling, according to Socrates, right? So I say we read, so we stopped in 346C, and he's also, remember, trying to bring Thrasymachus along. Okay. Jonathan, can I interest you in reading a little further?
I'm on the road, so I don't have my text with me, unfortunately. So I can't.
Okay.
I would love to otherwise, though. So thanks for asking.
That's
count on me next time.
Okay, sure. No problem. May I have a volunteer? Kit?
Oh, I was going to call out Rita. I think raise your hand first.
Oh, okay. Rita, do you want to read?
Oh, thanks, Kit. He said that he did not, and we did agree that the benefit of each art is peculiar.
We are, sorry, so we are in 346D, then this benefit getting wages.
Oh, okay.
Right? Oh, that's okay.
Then this benefit, getting wages, is for each not a result of his own art, but if it must be considered precisely, the medical art produces health, and the wage earner's art wages. The house builder's art produces a house, and the wage earner's art, following upon it, wages. And so it is with all the others. Each accomplishes its own work and benefits that which it has been set over. And if pay were not attached to it, would the craftsman derive benefit from the art? It doesn't look like it, he said. Does he then produce no benefit when he works for nothing? I suppose he does. Therefore, Thrasymachus, it is plain by now that no art or kind of rule provides for its own benefit. But, as we have been saying all along, it provides for and commands the one who is ruled, considering his advantage, that of the weaker, and not that of the stronger. It is for just this reason, my dear Thrasymachus, that I said a moment ago that no one willingly chooses to rule and get mixed up in straightening out other people's troubles. But he asks for wages because the man who is to do anything fine by art never does what is best for himself, nor does he command it, insofar as he is commanding by art, but rather what is best for the man who is ruled. It is for this reason, as it seems, that there must be wages for those who are going to be willing to rule, either money or honor or a penalty if he should not rule. What do you mean by that, Socrates, said Glaucon. The first two kinds of wages I know, but I don't understand what penalty you mean and how you can say it is a kind of wage. Continue?
Yes, just until B, 347A. A, sorry, yeah.
Then you don't understand the wages of the best men, I said, on account of which the most decent men rule, when they are willing to rule. Or don't you know what love of honor and love of money are said to be and are reproaches?
Okay, good, thanks. So, all right, so now he has elaborated a little bit more by what he means. Rulers not willing, and the three conditions that are attached to this argument, and the penalty of not ruling, right? So let's take it piece by piece. I suppose it's pretty straightforward what he means by wages and honor. Yes? Would somebody like to just summarize it? Just so I can hear you, and I sometimes feel I'm just speaking in a void or something. Yes, Jay.
Well, wages or income, honor, that's a tricky one, sort of. I mean, a claim from others. I mean, it touches very closely on ego. I would which doesn't directly address, and which I think motivates most people, but I could be editorializing there. So a claim is to, it deals with, honor deals with kind of your reputation in a positive way, and respect you garner from others.
Jeff.
Yeah, definitely where Jay's is on that with honor. I mean, definitely we know with wages that people need money to live. So that's beneficial that way. And the honor that one receives from putting oneself out there to assume that position and to maybe be under such heavy public scrutiny would garner a positive reputation. Even if you don't agree with a person, you could still commend them for stepping up and wanting to do something positive in the public eye.
So maybe, do you think, he is saying that he is actually combining this, or what he has in the back of his mind is the notion of wisdom, right? So there are some very broad conceptions that will always be at work in Plato, right? And so the idea that is connected to the just rule is also the idea of practical wisdom, right? Somebody who's wise, right? And honorable, and would take up this honor to rule. And he's going to rule for the benefit of all, right? Not just for the benefit of few strong people, but also of the weak, He's bringing up the issue of the weak, right? But then it's the issue of penalty that confuses Glaucon, right? He interrupts Socrates. And he says, well, I get it. I get it when you say it's about wages and it's about honor, but I really don't understand the penalty of not ruling. What do you mean by that? And Socrates gently insults him. Actually, then you don't understand the wages of the best man. Maybe you don't deserve to be the next ruler, in other words, perhaps. It's a very gentle insult, but it's an insult. And now Glaucon is, now it's the issue of penalty, that is becoming central, right? And we should try to parse it out, what he means by that. What is the penalty of not ruling? Jonathan.
Well, I think the operant word from Socrates is when he says, "You don't deserve to rule." The word "deserve," and I think that applies both to the positive payments of wages and honor, and it applies to the negative payment of penalty. In other words, the unifying concept there is the just reward for your effort or lack thereof. So it's consistent across it. There's you rule and you're going to get, and in the context of serving everybody, you will be rewarded in kind, whether that's positive or if you fail to do it, it'll be negative. And that's what Platfon's not getting, is that you're responsible both for the honorifics, but also for the penalty, the punishments for not ruling or not ruling well. Am I understanding it?
Okay. Well, think about it. If you are not ruled, so let's say we are the ruled, right? We are being ruled by the rulers. If we are ruled by a tyrant, what kind of a life are we going to live under tyranny?
A bad life.
A bad life, okay.
Unhappy, miserable.
Unhappy and miserable,
Yeah, it depends on whether you are a friend of the tyrant or not, right? If you're a friend of the tyrant, you could be in great position for the moment anyway.
But let's say we're just the commoners. You know, we serve the interests of the city. We pay taxes. We serve the interests of the city and we're ruled by a tyrant. Yes, so we're living a bad life. We're living an unhappy life. Do you think we are paying a price, a penalty, right? We are suffering and paying a penalty because we are not being ruled by a wise man, right? So the issue perhaps is that if you are a wise man and you choose not to rule, then you're paying a penalty. So Socrates now pay attention to the next section. We should really hone into the play of two words, necessity and penalty. The necessity of ruling, the penalty of not ruling. Right? Jay.
Well, the key there, I think, is he says the greatest of penalties is being ruled by a worse man.
Mm-hmm.
If one is willing to rule oneself.
And explain, Jay, what's behind your behind your thoughts or what's on your mind?
Well, I just sort of, that leaps out at me as being sort of the topic sentence that that's the penalty. You'll be subjected to a less good life if you have somebody who is not as able as you to rule and you allow that person, he or she, to take your place.
Yes.
The thing that bothers me about this is, ego blinds us, or at least clouds our vision. So how are we to judge ourselves as being more able than someone else?
Good question. Yeah.
Great.
Any thoughts on Jay's question?
That bothers me.
It's
Scott.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, go ahead, Scott. Go ahead.
No, you started talking, please.
Oh man. Okay. All right. Okay. For Jay's point, Jay, yeah, that's a great question, and I think that's where he goes, where Socrates goes with the love of honor and love of money are said to be and are reproaches, because it almost puts that on par, that if I think that I'm better than the person who's going to be seeking that position or is in that position, not doing a very good job, that makes me just as narcissistic as people who are going to be doing it for the love of money or just the love of honor. So I think you raise a good point. I can't see a difference offhand.
Oh.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar, but I think some of the penalty is trying to weigh that trade-off, that if you seek to rule because you don't want to be ruled by a lesser, you may be ruling yourself and ruling as a lesser, or you may be seen as an honor seeker, or you may be seen as a power hungry, power grabber. And so you may know that you need to rule because the other is lesser, but you don't want this perception of being, have those bad connotations. So there's a penalty in seeking the rule as a result of that as well.
Laura, and then Lisa.
The other thought I had was when it comes to practicing an art in the sense of the way Socrates has set this up, it would be the primary goal of a good and just ruler would be one who is working on the art of being just. And as long as your focus is on being just and not on the wages and the honor and perhaps other things, at least you know, and this is that whole, am I narcissistic by thinking I'm better? I think it's that if the art is your focus, you would at least be better than someone who is focused on the other elements.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lisa?
Just going back to a point that Jay made about ego, I think when you're thinking about yourself, that's very difficult to overcome. But what if there's a group of people that choose you because of who you are, and they know that you're not guided by money and you're not guided by honor. And again, maybe I'm thinking a little too democratic here, but that could remove the element of ego in terms of choosing the right ruler. And though you may be unwilling, you see from these people's point of view that it's in the best interest of everyone for you to become the ruler.
Right. Okay. These are all very good points. And let's deepen this and these ideas by reading a little further and see what Socrates is trying to say with the interplay of necessity and penalty. Okay? So, who is going to read next?
I will.
Oh, good. Kit, go on.
Which line did we leave off at? Sorry.
So we are, for this reason, we are in 347B.
Okay, yes.
Yeah.
For this reason, therefore, I said, the good aren't willing to rule for the sake of money or honor, for they don't wish openly to exact wages for ruling and get called hirelings, nor on their own secretly to take a profit from their ruling and get called thieves. Nor, again, will they rule for the sake of honor, for they are not lovers of honor. Hence, necessity and a penalty must be there in addition for them if they are going to be willing to rule. It is likely that this is the source of its being held to be shameful to seek to rule and not to await necessity. And the greatest of penalties is being ruled by a worse man if one is not willing to rule oneself. It is because they fear this, in my view, that decent men rule when they do rule. And at that time, they proceed to enter on rule, not as though they were going to something good, or as though they were going to be well off in it, but they enter on it as a necessity, and because they have no one better than or like themselves to whom to turn it over. For it is likely that if a city of good men came to be, there would be a fight over not ruling, just as there is now over ruling. And there it would become manifest that a true ruler really does not naturally consider his own advantage, but rather that of the one who is ruled. Thus, everyone who knows would choose to be benefited by another rather than to take the trouble of benefiting another. So I can in no way agree with Thrasymachus that the just is the advantage of the stronger. But this we shall consider again at another time. What Thrasymachus now says is, in my opinion, a far bigger thing. He asserts that the life of the unjust man is stronger than that of the just man. Which do you choose, Glaucon? I said. And which speech is truer in your opinion? I, for my part, choose the life of the just man as more profitable. Did you hear, I said, how many good things Thrasymachus listed a moment ago as belonging to the life of the unjust man? I heard, he said, but I'm not persuaded. Then do you want us to persuade him, if we're able to find a way, that what he says isn't true? How could I not want it, he said. Now, I said, if we should speak at length against him, setting speech against speech, telling how many good things belong to being just, and then he should speak in return, and we again, there'll be need of counting the good things and measuring how many each of us has in each speech, and then we'll be in need of some sort of judges who will decide. But if we consider just as we did a moment ago, coming to agreement with one another, we'll ourselves be both judges and pleaders at once. Most certainly, he said. Which way do you like? I said. The latter, he said.
Okay, good. Let's pause here. All right. So what do you think of necessity and penalty? What is going on in this paragraph? Well, the greatest penalty is established is by being ruled by the worse, right? So what is the necessity? What is the role of necessity? Jay?
Okay. Well, again, I think this paragraph is talking about good people, not everybody. They're talking about what does the good person want to do? And that's kind of a key point, which I sort of missed when I first read this. So a good person is, one is going to want the best person to rule, and preferably not themselves, because that person, it's a hardship. You have to look out for others rather than for yourself. So you don't want yourself or other people to be ruled by somebody who's less able. But that's supposed to be, and so like if you have a collection of good people, rather than having their ego's not mentioned here, of course, but rather than letting that take over, you're going to say just who is the best among us, and I hope it's somebody else, so I won't have to go through all these travails that are encountered when I'm being selfless and looking out for others, because looking out for others all the time is a pain.
Okay, let's put it that way. Let's put it another way, sorry. So the good man, right? The good man, let's also call him the wise man.
Which narrows the group.
It does. Absolutely, it does. Oh, yes.
We're talking a small group here.
Yes, not everybody's fit to rule. I think Socrates is clear. So the good man, the wise man. The wise man is moved by the love of wisdom, right? Say philosophy. And he's faced with the option whether to step up and rule or not, right? If he doesn't assume rule, power, then he's going to be ruled under tyranny or by tyranny, by a tyrannical rule. And so Socrates is posing the question in this way, and again, kind of bringing in a wider conception of wisdom and a wider conception of philosophy. Now, the reason why I say that is because, remember, Socrates, according to Plato or by Plato, has been forced into a role to offer his new teachings, new philosophical ideas, right, in this context. And he is really concerned. He is concerned, okay, if the wise men and if the good men don't step up, there is going to be a penalty to pay, right? And then if there is tyranny, what would be the role of philosophy? Can philosophy exist under tyranny? Right? That's the question he is asking. It's the same question that we raised in a different context in a couple of classes ago, when he was talking about what is the use of justice, right? And we translated that into the question of, okay, what is the use of philosophy? Is philosophy still useful? And so he is kind of circling back to this idea, can philosophy exist if it is not free? Right? If a wise man or a philosopher doesn't step up and assume rulership, then what is the price that we're going to pay? We'll pay a huge penalty. And in saying that, he's also trying to expose Thrasymachus in a different light. Are you that wise man? Glaucon, are you that wise man? Can you take up this burden of rulership? Do you have the practical wisdom to be a ruler? Mary, you were raising your hand.
Well, I just thought here, again, we discussed at several points how history helps inform this. And we know from reading the Apology in Crito that Socrates said at his trial that the Delphic oracle said he was, I think, the wisest man because he knew nothing. And Socrates was also notorious for not participating in the civic life of Athens. I mean, he was occasionally dragooned into it, but he didn't put himself forward. So this is, I thought, an interesting way of saying that philosophers should rule, and it should be someone like Socrates.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and so we should ask, what are the motivations of Socrates? Is he that innocent as he seems to be? Does he have an agenda? Laura.
Well, he's certainly casting aspersions on Thrasymachus, especially with what Thrasymachus's goal or belief that justice is. It's a very tyrannical justice in his mind. So by Socrates exposing that and saying there are alternatives, I mean, he's talking to the youth, and you'd think that that has some power. Clearly, Socrates also has some power here, or Thrasymachus wouldn't be debating him and trying to win a bit, or, you know.
Mm-hmm. That's right. I mean, I think it was established for all the men who are present here that they're in the company of two Enlightenment thinkers. One is a sophist and one is a non-sophist, but they are on par. You know, they're both trained in the art of rhetoric. They know the art of persuasion. They know how to argue and win people over. So of course, in that sense, you know, it's like a sport. You know, it's a sport of argumentation. And, you know, we're seeing that who is going to persuade whom and with what power, right? And Socrates is certainly differentiating himself as somebody who is not like Thrasymachus. You know, that Socrates apparently, or in these dialogues on the surface, he's saying, look, you know, I don't have money. I don't charge money for my teachings. And, you know, I'm not interested in the honors and power, but I am interested in one thing. And I'm interested in the power of philosophy and the power of wisdom. And I want philosophy to flourish. And I'm doubtful that it would flourish under your rulership or Glaucon's rulership, or, you know, he's not sure. You know, he's uncertain. He's like, well, can philosophy be free? Right? That because Socrates, this is Socrates' mission, right? He wants people to ask questions freely and not be punished. And he knows that there is a punishment for doing so. He was punished, right? So what is motivating? If rulership and power is the role of wisdom, that is a motivator for Socrates, right? And so he thinks that there is a necessity, some necessity, or that the wise men should be necessarily assuming rulership, because it would be for the good of everyone. That the wise men should not just be thinking about wisdom and philosophizing. What if they also assume? So that's the thought. That's, I think, the underlying thought that is driving Socrates to make his case and show the weaknesses of other people's arguments. Does that make sense? Mary Jo, you are deep in your thoughts.
I just feel like this is not going to convince the Symmachus or a tyrant or someone who thinks, if I'm in charge and all the benefits come to me by my injustice, who cares about wise rule or justice for the people or anything? So I don't think a tyrant's going to be convinced, and I'm sure we're going to get to that, but I feel like, yeah, so, I mean, we're convinced because we're in a democratic mindset.
Uh-huh.
But
yeah.
I think in some countries, they would agree with Thrasymachus right now, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah. I think that's very valid. Yes, Scott.
I know this is way outside the book, but Mary Jo brings that we might think so because we're in a democracy, but I think about the way our Constitution's written and all the checks and balances. I think a big part of our Constitution and its kind of lineage is about recognizing that rulers are not worldly and wise. They tend to be self-interested, and you need some checks and balances to keep that all in place.
There's some sound
yeah.
in the background. I don't know what this is. Okay. Any other comments to what Scott and Mary Jo just said? I think it's an interesting problem. There's this tension.
The answer to what Mary Jo is saying is, I mean, again, Socrates is addressing this to good men, right, or good people.
Well, yeah. Okay, go on.
So, the tyrant that would hear about anybody but himself, and accruing benefits to himself, that's not his audience here, right? Or who he's trying to appeal to.
Well, so maybe, I'll ask you, Jay, do you think Thrasymachus is a good man, Glaucon is a good man, Polemarchus, Cephalus? Can we describe them as good men in the Socratic framework?
Well, up to this point, in the case of I'd say no. Glaucon seems to be on the side of Socrates at this point.
But you said no. Why? Why don't they rise to the level of good men?
I said Glaucon might because mean, at least under Socrates' definition, he seems to be in his camp now.
Okay.
Thrasymachus, because, you know, again, he's just, you know, justice for the unjust is kind of what he's saying in a snappy sort of way, which is common sense on its head, at least, or what we think of as moral and just. So I would say he's not a good man at this point. I mean, he's just.
Okay. Okay. That's very good. Any other ideas? How should we square this? I think we should think as we read further. This is the tension. This is the tension that Plato's Socrates is wrestling with. And the tension is, what is the role of philosophy? What is its use when the rulers are not wise? When the rulers are tyrants? When the rule is assumed by bad men, as it were? Can philosophy exist and flourish and thrive under tyranny? Or does it have to be free to elaborate the conception of practical wisdom, to elaborate the conception of what a good life is? That's the tension that Socrates is wrestling with. And he doesn't have an answer, as it seems, as yet. Okay. Rich.
Yeah, I mean, aren't we leaving out something, and that is ego? I mean, Socrates would like to think of himself as the smartest guy in the room with all the answers. And ego does drive a lot of this. And, you know, back to Scott's point about the Constitution, it's the reason we have checks and balances. If you're not always going to get people who aren't personally motivated to power. And the argument could be made that Promachus is just being more honest and candid, that, you know, you are going to get people who seek advantage, so the trick is to control those appetites after they get in power, rather than hope that you're going to get a perfect person with no ego who doesn't, you know, really want to serve, but they draft him and put him in office.
So I have a question. How shall we define ego? What is ego?
Thinking of yourself over other people.
Terrible noise.
In the sense,
yeah, it's terrible. I have no idea where this sound is coming from.
I know it's bad.
Yeah.
Yes.
Maybe everybody mute.
Why don't we see if
Sounds
everyone
like-
mutes?
Yeah.
Everybody is mute except for me right now. Okay. So, okay. Anyway, I was asking you. Because the question of ego has come up more than once today. And it is something that Socrates hasn't addressed. So it's not a Socratic category. We agree? Disagree? Agree?
It seems closest to me to the concept of honor or pursuit of honor that has been categorically said something that good men don't pursue or aren't interested in.
So we have to be careful. And I think we should try, as an exercise for ourselves, to make sense of all the categories, the theoretical categories that are being addressed and raised in this text, okay? And we should try to understand it in terms of those categories, because if we introduce a new category or a new idea, then we have to have a definition of that. So now I do have a definition of what ego is, but I was curious to know how you were invoking that, because it is a conceptual category. And we could think about it in terms of psychology. It's a psychological category. It's a category of psychoanalysis. And it also is a category of philosophy, right? So if we do want to understand the notion of justice as it has been articulated in various ways by Plato, but if we want to understand it in a different term, then we'll have to do some work to understand justice in terms of ego. So it's not just, but we could also be just using it as a common parlance term, you know, as a commonsensical term that we kind of use to make sense of our affairs.
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then it's a different conversation, I would say. Jeff.
Yeah, I run into a problem where somebody may have particularly high ego and think very much of themselves, but be a damn good ruler. So I run into a rabbit hole in all the directions
yes.
that we go
yes.
in the Republic, where there's always another answer to come up with, you know, to counter that next answer, or another scenario, or another example.
Yes. Lauren.
If you think of ego as a sense of, you know, strong sense of self or self-awareness, then you could say that Socrates has probably a pretty good ego. I think in some ways he'd have to know himself well enough to have these open-ended questions, and, you know, because he does say, in fact, I don't know much at all. And I think that's someone who's probably thought long and hard about himself, his place in the world. And
Scott.
I was thinking the way the term perhaps has been used is the advantage of the stronger. Ego is the advantage of the stronger. The stronger wants their advantage, that they have an interest and they want to invoke their interest on others. And maybe Socrates is saying, no, the ruler should want to do what's best for the governed in opposition to that idea. But then when you dice it again, as Jeff has said, okay, so the ruler does what's interest of the ruled, but the ruled has many different interests. So do you aggregate the interests of the ruled and you do what's in the majority rule? I mean, what if you kill one person and take his land and distribute it among all the rest? The majority wins, and so you've done the interest of the ruled, except for one person. So it kind of works out. Maybe, is that right? You know, so I think that, again, kind of Jeff's point, there are all kinds of, you know, challenges as you think through the perspective of how this power is, you know, used to rule.
Okay, good. So, yes, Mary Jo.
Yeah, I think of ego kind of more on the lines of what Laureen was saying. It's a sort of self-confidence and a feeling of your ability, your expertise. And this is, you know, I'm a kind of an honor society. You're not going to be able to not have an ego and to not feel proud of what you're doing. But if you can keep that in the background or keep that aside, if you're able to do that. So I don't think ego you can't have someone with no ego. So it's someone who's able to be wise in spite of ego.
That's good. I think that's very good. So ego is the self. Ego is what defines us as who we are. So that's absolutely right. But I would say that it's not the category of ego that Socrates thought in terms of, but it's the category of the soul. It's the soul of the man that he thought about. He was interested in how the soul can be a good soul, right? And so, if that's why I was saying that we should be very attentive to the categorical framework that Plato is establishing through Socrates to elaborate his arguments, right? So ego is not the category of the Republic. We can say perhaps that soul comes closer to the category of the Republic. The soul comes closer to understanding the character of the ruler than the category of the ego. But as we understand things today, I think both Mary Jo and Laureen, you're right that ego is the notion of the self. Ego defines who we are. Without the ego, we won't exist. We don't amount to anything. But it would be, there's a difference in saying or calling somebody egotistical. That's very different. So anyway, we're not going to go in that direction. Okay, so very good. We are going to carry on and further the conversation and move on to Socrates' third argument, and maybe the fourth and the fifth. We will see how it goes. But I want you to think about this one question. Towards the end of book 1, do you think that Socrates thinks he has failed to persuade his audience? Or do you think he has won over his enemies?
So Tia, we'll finish, or we'll go through book 1.
Yeah. We'll just read together.
It's great. I just didn't want to read ahead because it's so dense. I want to stick with what we're doing. You know?
No need to rush it, really. So we'll just read together, bring your questions. Feel free. I know that Kathy, you posted that video. You free to post your questions and thoughts. I was thinking maybe of also posting some questions and based on our class discussions, if that helps, just to enrich our own understanding, I'll try. My past couple of weeks were just terribly busy, but I think I will have some time so I could do that. I'm happy to do it. I would like to do it. So
that's great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, have a lovely rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
And,
thanks,
bye.
you too.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
All right.
Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.